Okay, hello everyone. I'm Kathryn David from NYU, and I'm going to be speaking about post-war West Ukraine and the role of religion in Soviet governance. So I have up here this phrase, Bolsheviks don't close churches, and it was a phrase that I came across in my documents as part of this wider dissertation project that I'm doing about essentially religion and nationalities policy in post-war Soviet West Ukraine. I was reading a report from Litvin, who was head of Agitprop for Soviet Ukraine, who was writing to Khrushchev, who was party secretary at the time. And Litvin said that one of his, minions overheard a group of locals in newly Soviet Lviv saying, "Oh, the Bolsheviks aren't closing the churches. Bolsheviki tserkvei не закрывают." This is in March of 1946. And Litvin hears this and he says, "Oh, this is evidence of our success." He sums up his conclusions and he says, "The population of the oblast is reacting correctly." Правильно. And I became very interested in why would the idea that Bolsheviks aren't closing churches, from the perspective of the Communist Party, of Agitprop, why would that be an evidence of Soviet success? And in order to understand this, you have to look at March of 1946, what was happening, specifically the Lviv Sabor. And this was a Sabor, an official church meeting, which was held in newly Soviet Lviv. And it was held in order to conduct what they referred to as a reunification, возъединение in Russian, возъединение in Ukrainian, of the Greek Catholic Church with the Russian Orthodox Church. And this Sabor, it annulled the Union of Brest, which actually was the declaration that created the Greek Catholic Church in 1596. Before this forced religious reunification, the Greek Catholic Church, as many of you know, had been a powerful religious institution in Lviv and in the surrounding region of Galicia. And it was the majority church among the Ukrainian population, among the Ukrainian peasantry in this region. But after the 1946 Sabor, millions of believers in these newly Soviet Ukrainian oblasts of Lviv, Drohobych, Ternopil, and Stanislav were to become Russian Orthodox, along with some members of the clergy. And so this allowed for an entire infrastructure for the Russian Orthodox Church in West Ukraine to be built essentially from the Greek Catholic Church and through a process that was led by secular Soviet authorities, as well as their selected representatives in the Russian Orthodox Church. But as I mentioned in my paper, by November of 1946, 8 months later, Karpov, who was the head of the newly created Committee for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, which I abbreviate as KAROK, he was frustrated by this process. And his frustration came from this idea that there was a lack of understanding of what the political meaning was of this Sabor. And for me, this raises the question, well, what was the political meaning of the Sabor? Karpov is frustrated that his people don't understand the political meaning, so what was it? And so as I try to argue in this paper, there's not really a definitive answer in March of 1946, and whichever answer may be argued to be the correct one in March of 1946 kind of has already changed by November, and it also depends on who you ask. I argue that the political meaning of this church reunification only began to take form through the process of its enforcement, an enforcement that was carried out by secular authorities, including members of state security services, so the NKVD and then the KGB. There's a lot of name changes around this time. And they're working closely with KAROK, this Committee for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is a Soviet state institution. Under these groups' directions, enforcing church reunion meant connecting Orthodox religious ritual to loyalty and participation in the Soviet project, while Greek Catholic rituals became associated with the disloyalty that was often believed by Soviet authorities to be inherent to West Ukraine, as well as the threat of radical anti-Soviet Ukrainian nationalism. And so it was this understanding of church reunion by those charged with enforcing it that ultimately gave this ambiguous process political meaning after the fact and created lasting associations with religious ritual and secular nationalism in both Russia and Ukraine during the Soviet period and after. So in this way, I argue reunification with orthodoxy began to be thought of and implemented similarly to early Soviet nationalities policy in the 1920s and 30s. Like official nationality, orthodoxy may originally have been seen as a temporary concession, but over time, enforcement of this religious reunion and promoting orthodoxy in West Ukraine became a critical part of becoming Soviet and Ukrainian in this region. So I know that many of you are familiar with the Greek Catholic Church, but one of the things I wanted to emphasize with the Greek Catholic Church is the importance of borders when it comes to this church and how it was created. So it was created in 1596 as a way to bring Byzantine Rite, at the time people who would have been thought of as Ruthenians, into the newly created Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and allowing them to be under the jurisdiction of the Vatican. But one of the ways that the church expanded and lost territory in the centuries that followed was through changes of borders. So one of the most important ones were the partitions of Poland, where a great deal of these Greek Catholics become part of the Russian Empire. And so the Russian Empire, under Catherine, under Nicholas, and finally under Alexander III and Chelm, also embark on church reunification projects, just like the Soviets do. They believe that these Greek Catholics are, in fact, truly Russian Orthodox, and as a part of creating a new border, of bringing these subjects into the Russian Empire, they must be reunited or transferred to Russian Orthodoxy. But I argue that the forced reunification under the Soviets is significantly different from these imperial reunifications. And this really comes down to different ideas about nations and the different kind of state that the Soviet Union was. So there are similar considerations. Both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union are very concerned, some might even say paranoid, about the role of the Vatican. And they're also both states that can use Russian Orthodoxy to their advantage. And the Soviet Union is using Russian Orthodoxy to its advantage at this time. But one of the important distinctions is that when Greek Catholics were reunited under Catherine and Nicholas in the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, these Greek Catholic populations were seen as potentially loyal to the Polish nobility and later as potential members of an imagined Polish nation. The Soviet Church reunification, however, operated with an entirely different perception of nationalism and national belonging in now Soviet West Ukraine, in addition to being conducted by an entirely different kind of state, specifically a mobilizational state. For Soviet authorities, Greek Catholics were Ukrainians. This was a distinct nationality that was the titular nationality of Soviet Ukraine. Soviet authorities, when they began studying Greek Catholics and becoming interested in them, especially during World War II, they didn't see them as potentially Polish or loyal to Poland. In fact, quite the opposite. They saw them as Ukrainians, potentially Soviet Ukrainians, who could become part of the Soviet Ukrainian nation, and frankly, as particularly hostile to their Polish neighbors. Church reunification was a key aspect for them of reuniting Ukraine itself, as you can see from the borders up here on the map, bringing the so-called ethnographically Ukrainian territories into one state, specifically a Ukrainian nation state within the Soviet Union. And so I became interested in then how this narrative of church reunification became a mobilizational narrative. How did it actually work on the ground? And I found that Russian Orthodoxy became a way to mobilize the clergy of the Greek Catholic Church and its believers while disavowing and excising elements of the church seen as anti-Soviet. And so part of this connection between Sovietization and promoting orthodoxy ends up having to do with the interaction of the priests with Soviet authorities during the reunification process. So priests who were wishing to reunite had to fill out a zaявlenie, basically a testimonial, which is up here. And they had to send this to both secular authorities as well as religious authorities. This zaявlenie is located in the SBU archives, in the former KGB archives. The NKVD was one of the people that had to be reading these zaявlenia, helping to write them. And the templates were actually distributed to these priests by members of Kerak, by the NKVD, and then they would be accepted by somebody in the Russian Orthodox Church who would invite the priests to a religious ceremony, and then the priests would bring these documents to the Oblspolkom, so the local state authorities, to prove that they had done the ceremony and could formally register as Orthodox priests. And so for Karpov, when he's trying to understand the political meaning of this reunion, he saw the political meaning in this process that individual priests had to go to, this religious ceremony with an episcope, as well as an appearance at the local state office, and writing down exactly why they wanted to do this reunification, and showing that they were aware of the proper Soviet narrative that went along with it. And engaging in this process, it bound priests to an official Orthodox church run by the Soviet state. And so the second component of this connection was religious ritual. And this starts to explain why members of the NKVD began to monitor religious ritual and ultimately conclude that priests who were not following proper Russian Orthodox ritual, as it was defined by Soviet secular authorities, were seen as refusing to consecrate their churches as spaces loyal to Soviet power, and instead were displaying loyalty to the so-called Banderovцы. And so even though reunification ended up being declared complete in 1949, this political meaning of reunification continued decades later. And essentially, by connecting religious reunification to this larger narrative about Ukraine and a special place for the Ukrainian nation within the Soviet Union, Soviet authorities were able to find in the Orthodox Church and its rituals a usable past and a loyal institution through which to project a new post-war Ukrainian nationalities policy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.